Podcast 7 of the Thorax series, the coronary circulation. This podcast is going to continue looking at the anatomy of the heart and detail the coronary arteries and the veins. So the heart is just like any other organ within the body, and it requires an adequate blood supply to deliver oxygen and nutrients and remove carbon dioxide and waste products. The heart receives this blood supply via the coronary circulation, which is comprised of coronary arteries and coronary veins. So let's start with the arterial supply. The two coronary arteries are the only branches of the ascending aorta and are located behind the aortic valve's right and left cusps, in the right and left aortic sinuses. Therefore, the coronary arteries fill with blood when the elastic recoil of the aorta pushes blood back towards the aortic valve and fill these sinuses. So let's look at the individual coronary arteries. The right coronary artery leaves the aorta and passes to the right side of the pulmonary trunk to run in a groove between the right atria and the right ventricle. This is known as the atrioventricular, or sometimes the coronary groove. Just as it enters this groove, it gives off an ascending nodal branch which supplies the SA node. This is located in the superior part of the right atrium. The right coronary artery carries on within the atrioventricular groove and curves around the right border of the heart to run along the posterior surface, still within this atrioventricular groove. As the right coronary artery curves around the right border, it gives off a descending right marginal artery, which supplies the myocardium of the right ventricle. On the posterior surface, the right coronary artery terminates as the posterior interventricular artery, which descends along the interventricular septum towards the apex. Also coming from the right coronary artery at its termination is a small branch which supplies the AV node. So generally, the right coronary artery supplies a large portion of the heart and gives off two arteries which supply the main conducting centres of the heart. Along its path, the right coronary artery supplies the right atrium, most of the right ventricle, and usually the posterior third of the ventricular septum. So now let's turn to the left coronary artery. This is the shorter of the two arteries and is only 2 to 3 centimetres long. It emerges from the aorta between the left auricle and the left side of the pulmonary trunk and immediately divides into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular artery. The anterior interventricular artery runs in the anterior interventricular groove and runs towards the apex of the heart. At the apex, it curves posteriorly and sometimes can anastomose with the posterior interventricular artery, which has come from the right coronary. The anterior interventricular artery gives off numerous branches which supply both ventricles, with a prominent diagonal branch that curves to the left and supplies the left ventricle. The circumflex artery, which branched off the left coronary, is smaller than the anterior interventricular, and this curves around the left border of the heart in the atrioventricular groove. Coming off the circumflex artery to supply the left ventricle and running parallel to the diagonal artery is the left marginal artery. Once the circumflex artery has given off the left marginal, it usually terminates on the posterior surface of the heart. So in general, the left coronary artery and its branches supply the left atrium, a large portion of the left ventricle, part of the right ventricle, and most of the interventricular septum. Some common variations of the coronary circulation have been well described, and depending on which coronary artery gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery, determines which coronary artery is said to be dominant. So typically, about 70% of people are right dominant, which means the right coronary artery gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery, and this is like I just described. A left dominant heart would have the posterior interventricular artery derived from the circumflex artery as it curves around the left border of the heart, and this is observed in about 15% of people. There is also codominance, which is found in the remaining 15%, and this is where both the right and left coronary arteries converge at the junction of the interventricular septum, and both give branches that run in the posterior interventricular groove. Another variation is the nodal artery, which usually comes from the right coronary artery, but in approximately 40% of people, the nodal artery comes off the circumflex branch of the left coronary, and this nodal artery runs along the posterior surface of the left atrium towards the SA node. The branches of the coronary arteries that supply the myocardium are considered to be end arteries. That is, they do not form anastomoses with other branches and end in the myocardium. Some of the branches do form anastomoses, and this is where there is considerable variation between hearts. An example of this is where the anterior and posterior interventricular arteries join around the apex of the heart. So to finish the podcast, I want to detail the venous drainage of the heart. Now, the majority of the heart's waste products, like carbon dioxide, are drained into the right atrium by the coronary sinus, which receives a series of cardiac veins. The coronary sinus runs from left to right along the posterior surface of the heart in the atrioventricular groove. The coronary sinus, though, is commonly referred to as sitting in the coronary groove, but these are the same regions. Along its course, the main tributary is the great cardiac vein, and this originates from the heart's apex and runs along the anterior surface, alongside the anterior interventricular artery. It then turns left over the left border of the heart and runs alongside the circumflex artery within the coronary groove to reach the coronary sinus. The great cardiac vein drains approximately the same parts of the heart that the left coronary artery supplied. Accompanying the posterior interventricular artery and the right marginal artery are the middle and small cardiac veins. These run towards the coronary groove and join with the coronary sinus, draining the same region that the right coronary artery supplies. So the majority of the venous blood is returned to the right atrium by draining into the coronary sinus. Also draining venous blood back into the right atrium are the anterior and the smallest cardiac veins. The anterior cardiac veins are a series of small veins that run over the anterior surface of the heart and drain directly into the right atrium, whilst the smallest cardiac veins run directly from the capillary beds of the myocardium into the chambers of the heart. So in this podcast, we've looked at the coronary circulation and detailed the right and left coronary arteries, and then finally we looked at the coronary sinus and its tributaries. In the next podcast, number 8, I'll give a general overview of the arterial supply and venous drainage of the thoracic wall.